This podcast is brought to you by Ho Chi Minh Greens. Ho Chi Minh Greens is the only nutritional supplement that is going to prepare you for the draft. Yes, that's right. It is a prescription that will make you ready to fight the losing battle. So, if you take Ho Chi Minh Greens, you can kiss all of your nutritional needs. Saigon, go ahead. We're going to talk about Vietnam.
And why we lost the Vietnam War, which I think is actually very important. How the French actually lost it first, before we even got in there. I have here in my notes that General Navarre pretty much overestimates the power of air power, which he has an air force and the Vietnamese don't. Which he actually overestimates the power of air power, which leads to him being defeated at Diem Diem Phu.
Well, the other point is they had a very stationary defense. They were basically surrounded by the Vietnamese, and that let, I believe, if I'm right, the Vietnamese dug tunnels, didn't they?
They did, yes.
And stuff like that to get up close to their positions, and they just gradually wore down the French.
Gradually wore them down. It was like a meat grinder, which then leads to the United States getting involved after the French being kicked out, Which I was actually doing research for this too.
Because he was the nationalist figure who the people respected.
Yeah.
And, to look at how well respected he was, just look at the fact that once Vietnam got its independence, they renamed Saigon Ho Chi Minh City. I read something before I came on this podcast that I think he was very willing to accept help from the United States.
He was, yeah.
In order to develop his country. Had we done that, who knows how, what course things would have taken in Southeast Asia, because just like, we did with, Germany and Japan after World War II helping them, had we helped Vietnam? We don't know.
We're allies right now.
We don't know what the history of Southeast Asia would have been.
We could have been allies.
The Khmer Rouge may not even come to power in Cambodia because weren't they the result?
They were the result.
The result of the Vietnam War.
They were the result of the Vietnam War.
And look what happened to all the Cambodians that died, because of their ascension and stuff.
Yeah, it was actually Vietnam that actually invaded Cambodia to actually fight off the Khmer Rouge.
Right, which again tells you something about the Vietnamese and what we thought of them. We thought of them as a threat, that they would, go beyond their borders and push the communist philosophy and ideology.
It's the domino theory.
Wasn't in it altogether. They were more concerned with themselves, and then it shows in what they did in Cambodia that they were wanted more of a civilized order.
And they were a separate branch of communism from the Soviet branch and the Chinese branch of communism.
Exactly, because I know you were thinking of getting into this later, but Ho Chi Minh, although called a communist, was not a spreader of the ideology. He was using communism to benefit his nation and his people, but he was not going to spread it beyond his borders.
Yes, he was first and foremost a nationalist.
A nationalist, right.
First and foremost a true nationalist.
Right.
Yeah. Which really comes back into how the actual Vietnamese really saw the Vietnam War, that we saw it as an element of the Cold War. They didn't see it that way. They saw it as a civil war, through their eyes.
But what I find amazing is, I don't know, maybe this is getting off topic, but after the war in Vietnam and everything that we did in there, that years later they did not hold it against us.
Yeah,
they have not held it against us. I find that astounding.
Yeah,
and again, it shows you something about the Vietnamese people. And we're in good relations with Vietnam right now. In fact, Vietnam is really an ally with us in Southeast Asia against Chinese expansionism.
Absolutely, yeah.
And stuff like that. So I just find it, that you would think that they would have held it against us, but they haven't.
Yeah, most furniture in furniture stores nowadays in the U.S. is actually just made in Vietnam.
I think you could say the same thing about Japan too.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Again, as I mentioned that. Look what we did with Germany and Japan. Are two of our closest allies.
Yeah, we rebuilt them.
And despite the fact that we fought a very bloody war, and it just shows you what happens when you have a foreign policy that's not just based on the gun, but on diplomacy and a little bit of compassion and stuff.
We actually still have landmines in Vietnam, still killing people.
Oh yeah, and then the effects of Agent Orange.
One of the interesting things I think about this war is that it took us. It felt kind of chaotic, the fact that we even had this war. And so when you look at the mark that it made on history, you can ask yourself, if things had gone slightly differently, what kind of situation would we be in now? If things, I feel like it turned the tides of how Americans even culturally viewed war
and themselves.
But I think what I find more interesting, if the Vietnam War hadn't occurred, besides international events, is would Johnson have gotten reelected in '68? Would he have stayed in and gotten reelected? If he gets reelected, Nixon doesn't come into the presidency. Nixon doesn't come in the presidency. You don't have Watergate, and you don't have Nixon going to China.
Or the Pentagon Papers.
Or whatever. But so then what happened? Then what you got to ask yourself is, how would U.S.-Chinese relations have developed?
Less outsourcing.
Without Nixon having started the process. Now, somebody else eventually would have started it. But how would things have gone?
It could have been way later. It could have been Bill Clinton to start that.
Right. You don't know. And then, it's interesting to think again what would have happened. But no Vietnam War, you might not have had Nixon.
But how would Americans have seen themselves if the Vietnam War doesn't happen? Would they lose their innocence in the same way? Would Americans watching their TV screens, because Vietnam War was called the first war fought on the American television screen.
Right. Which that's something, Steve, that's a good point. Yeah. I hadn't thought about that when we've discussed Vietnam and stuff like that before. But, it's like people could see it for themselves. Previous wars were over there.
They're distant.
This was right up close, and you could see the horrors of it and stuff like that. So you're right. It's a good point to make.
It's like how many Americans had their conscience evoked by the images that they saw on their TV screen, and from that became more introspective about the actual kind of government that they wanted to have in their country, that if they don't see those images, would their consciousness be evoked in the same way?
No. And, to kind of add to that point is Vietnam was really the first war we lost. I know we mentioned this before the podcast started. That was another hit to our psyche.
That many Americans can't even admit to this day that we lost.
We can't admit that we walked out of there without a win.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. Because America was, we won. We helped win World War I. We helped win World War II.
Truly undefeated.
Right. And stuff like that. And this was a culture shock to our psyche that we weren't invincible.
Where Johnson said in '64 that America always wins the wars that we undertake. He said that. We always win the wars that we undertake. That was true up until that point in time. After 72, it is no longer true.
Yeah. But the fact is, we picked the wrong war. Is because Vietnam was really unwinnable.
That's the art of war. That's Sun Tzu.
I know that's
picking your battles wisely.
That's a topic you wanted to get to because the Vietnamese were fighting on their home turf.
Yes,
they were fighting for their independence. They did not want foreigners influencing their events. And
can you blame them?
No, but it's like. Given the fact the jungle and you don't often see an occupy. I shouldn't use the word occupying because that's not really essentially what we were, but you don't see an outside force being able to win a war against a homegrown insurgency.
Yeah, counterinsurgency.
A counterinsurgency, because they're fighting for their homes. It's like if somebody invaded your home, you'd fight like hell. And, this is what they were doing. They did not want foreign people in their land.
And I don't blame them one bit for that. I mean, many folks don't even actually know this, but most Americans don't realize that after the Vietnam War ended, China and Vietnam went to war in 79 to 80.
Right. Right. Exactly. And the whole... the whole premise for getting into Vietnam was the domino effect. Because although Ho Chi Minh, like we've said before, was he was a communist, but he was first and foremost, and I've checked other people's opinions on this, and they agree, he was a nationalist. He was using communism to benefit his people. He was not out to export the ideology, and that's what we feared, and that's where we were wrong in thinking. And
he was not a believer in worldwide communism like a Lenin.
No,
he was more like a Joseph Tito.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're
spot on with that one. Did the Cold War have to happen in your opinion?
Yeah. I think because the ideologies were so opposite, and America came out of World War II as a major influential country, and the Soviet Union wanted that too, and so we clashed over our influence in the world, and so it came out to the fact that we had spheres of influence, and competition on a world scale, and stuff like that, as to whose system was better, and but that's getting away from Vietnam. That's getting a little bit away from Vietnam,
but still ties into it.
Yeah.
If the United States were to nuke Hanoi, do you think that would actually allow us to win the Vietnam War? If we actually went nuclear?
Oh, if we went nuclear? Jeez.
It would start World War III
soon
thereafter, but I think we could possibly win had we went nuclear.
Yeah, but at what cost?
But it's not worth it.
At what cost? At what cost?
At the cost of World War III and humanity.
We used nukes in the Vietnamese. It's like, to what end? Against Japan, as bad as the press was on that one, there was at least a logic behind it.
That one you could justify.
Whether justify or not, but there was a logic behind it. You couldn't to invade the Japanese main islands. They estimated would have cost 1 million American lives
and Russian lives too.
Well, whatever. If Russia was involved, so you really didn't want to put boots on the ground if you couldn't help it. Here you're not fighting somebody who attacked you. Where we were in there to prevent South Vietnam from going communist or whatever. I don't think there's the same kind of rationale there as you had, with the Japanese and stuff like that. So
if anything, we actually
I really think that would have been that would have really turned out bad. I'm not sure exactly what would have happened, but certainly we would have brought down world opinion on us.
If anything, we actually attacked the Vietnamese first. Because the Gulf of Tonkin was actually proven later on to actually be sort of a false flag that the USS Maddox actually was not under attack from Vietnamese torpedoes. Right.
Again, it was used as an excuse to get in, and under the idea that it was becoming important at the time to fight communism, and we perceived Ho Chi Minh as being, he was an acknowledged communist, but we really misinterpreted who he was and who he represented.
And his branch of communism.
Right, his branch of communism, right.
That we saw communism as sort of like a monolithic group, as opposed to what it really was, which was different branches of the ideology that had different MOs.
It wasn't a Russian ideology, which was to spread it, but we didn't make that distinction, and so when we got into the war, it turned out to be for the wrong reason,
with the wrong strategy,
with probably the wrong strategy, right?
The best strategy would have been to probably not to fight, because we used the body count strategy, which I was getting into before, which was essentially the idea of just doing search and destroy missions to kill as many Vietnamese as possible, which caused our soldiers to inflate their numbers. Yeah. Which then leads to a credibility gap.
Right.
Because now they're telling the American people.
Which is what Tet did.
Yes.
Tet laid bare the fact that we weren't being told
the truth,
what was exactly happening. And I think, like you said before, we were talking about before the podcast started, is that it wasn't until Walter Cronkite really gave his opinion on the war that things began to turn in America, as what was towards the war. Now, I grew up during that time.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. So,
did you watch that broadcast?
I don't remember if I watched that broadcast, but I know I have seen.
You definitely heard about it during the time period.
I'm sure I probably did, but it's just it turned the opinion, and I remember thinking, when before Tet, I'd hear 1,000. Or whatever it was, or 5, whatever the numbers were, 2,000, Viet Cong killed, during the week. They'd always give their weekly numbers, and how I said, oh man, we're really, we're gonna win this thing. How many, we're gonna eventually wipe out the Viet Cong.
Yeah,
and it turned out we were far from it.
Very far.
We weren't close, and Tet proved that.
The whole idea with the body count strategy was that the North Vietnamese would reach a certain breaking point in terms of loss of casualties before we would. Okay. And it turns out we reached our breaking point first.
Now, was that a real strategy, or was that just
strategy?
Yeah, I mean, was that just something they were saying though?
By attrition, war, winning by attrition. Yeah.
The idea was kill as many Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army regulars faster than the North Vietnamese could replace them.
Another time, I had a friend of mine killed, and I was very upset. And I asked this Vietnamese for his ID card, and he said, "Come Viet," and that means I don't understand in Vietnamese. And it just pissed me off, so I pulled out my knife and I killed him. And it didn't bother me at all. I just called in, I said, "One VC kill." And they said, "How do you know he's a VC?" And I said, "Because he's dead." And they laughed and said, "Okay."
Let's talk about the actual culture of Vietnam. Because I've heard some people say that as far as the actual culture of many Asiatic countries, that the way that they view themselves and how they view pain can sometimes be very, very different. How they're able to almost place their focus outside of themselves. Well, I've heard stories of people actually interrogating like Viet Cong who have had limbs blown off, who have had arms blown off, and they're able to speak and talk very coherently because they're able to place their focus outside of themselves.
Well, I think, Asians in general, I think they're very spiritual people.
Yes.
So, I think that kind of plays into what you're saying, is that when you have that kind of spirituality, it gives you strength.
You definitely have to be.
I think it gave them strength. And, like I said, that, although, we've repeated it a few times, the fact that they were on their own home soil, they were a tough group.
Walter Cronkite, when he gave his opinion on the Vietnam War, in some ways, him doing that kind of changed cable news forever. Because before then, you didn't have news anchors giving their opinion. It was always just the information.
Right.
Here's the first time where you actually had someone giving their opinion on what they're seeing. When beforehand, he actually was pro the Vietnam War. Most Americans back at that time period, it's almost hard to explain to someone who's young, who's even my age or 20 years old or 18 years old. But back in, say, 1962, if the U.S. government did something, it was just assumed that the government was right. If they went to war, if they did something, it was just assumed, well, it's the United States government.
But I think you're going to get this into a later part of the podcast, but I don't know if I can maybe bring it up now. I think one of the effects of the Vietnam War on the United States was the fact that it did damage credibility of government and government institutions. I think that's something that's carried through to this day. In fact, it is really bad nowadays. Is if you look at the approval ratings of various agencies of the government and stuff like that, it's really bad.
It's under 20%.
But I think prior to that, it was like, the government said something, oh yeah, okay, but now it's like it's gone in the opposite extreme. We don't believe anything the government is saying anymore.
Now, do you think we've even recovered from that credibility gap? No, that we never actually
No, it's actually worse today than it's ever been.
Yeah. That in terms of that credibility gap, we've never fully even recovered from that.
No, in fact, it's accelerated. I mean, again, Steve, just look at it yourself. What's happening today? You look at how the court system is what's thought about. I mean, you look at everything has become politicized and stuff like that, and it's. I mean, that's an entirely different podcast if we get into what's happened today. But no, it's in fact it's accelerating.
Beforehand, you said that the Vietnam War is like one of the 4 most important wars or turning points,
or historical events in U.S. history.
in American history.
Yeah.
The first one, of course, being the American Revolution.
The Civil War.
The Civil War.
The Civil War, I mean, obviously is there. And World War II promoted us as a world power.
Yes.
I mean, out of all the countries in World War II, we're the ones who came out of it.
In better shape.
In better shape, and we came out the world power.
Folks forget Russia was devastated.
Stuff like that, and the world order we established has lasted up until the present day, and that world order is now under attack.
It is under attack.
But again,
right
that's
now.
another podcast.
You know, because after World War II, people think about Russia being like a world superpower, and of course it was. But I think people sort of underestimate the sheer devastation and destruction that was imposed by the Germans in Russia during World War II.
But I think the other thing is Russia was a military superpower.
Yes.
They never were an economic superpower, and that's the advantage we had over them, and that's really the tool we used.
That is true.
You know, in terms of our standing in the world, Russia could never compete with us on an economic basis. And in fact, today they're like a third world economy, really.
Oh yeah, the fall of the wall proved that.
I think California has a bigger economy than they do.
That they didn't occupy Poland and Yugoslavia.
Right.
That they would really have no way to actually keep those countries under their sphere of influence. We can do it economically. They couldn't do it that way.
Right. But in fact, an economic influence is stronger than the military, because military you can maybe fight or whatever. But if you have economic dependency, you know, and if your trade relationship is important to you, you're going to hurt if you try to end that. And that's actually a bigger influence, I think, than.
Now, what was it like being in your home? You know, like what kind of conversations happen around like your dinner table?
My parents and my sister weren't into, current affairs as much or whatever. So I really didn't have. There really wasn't, that much of a conversation. My conversation would be more in school, classmates and stuff.
Classmates and teachers?
Yeah, and teachers and stuff like that.
And how would they like the Vietnam War? Was there a change before and after the Tet Offensive in many people's minds where you had people that were supporting that just totally flipped?
I don't recall anything significant as far as that goes in terms of people. Because, again, I was in my teens at the time, and so, to get, how various people were feeling, you really, in your teens, you're not reaching out to a broad audience. I didn't have that interaction to get that kind of feedback.
Did you have friends being drafted, or?
Yeah, in fact, there's a story with that. I was, part of the lottery. If you remember the short-lived, I forgot how long it lasted. The short-lived lottery, and of course, when they had the lottery for me, I'm sitting there wondering what I'd get. And when I heard it, it was like I was 352.
Yeah,
which meant I wasn't going to be drafted. I had two cousins that went to Vietnam.
Did they come back?
Yeah. One was a Marine, but I think of the two, the war affected him.
Yeah,
the war affected him. But he was a Marine, and then I had his brother was drafted and went there, and the only story I can remember from him was he said. I think they were taking a Vietnamese body in a helicopter, and it fell out of the helicopter, and how he felt it was stupid because they went back trying to recover it, suffered losses because of it. He felt that was ridiculous. That's the only story I remember him telling me. But
was it like a South Vietnamese fighter?
No, it was I believe it was a Viet Cong.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know. They felt necessary to recover that. I'm pretty sure that's what it was, and that's why he felt that. That I'm pretty sure I got the story on that correct, but I know he came back as well, and then I know my sister worked. My sister's boss, who she worked for, says he could remember having his arm. He can remember having arms up to his shoulders in Agent Orange, mixing the stuff. He's still alive today. He never got any cancer or anything.
Really?
Like that. Yeah, but he could remember, the Agent Orange and arm, and stuff like that. So, but those are the only things I can remember. Even though I grew up then, like I said, if I had been in my 20s,
Yeah.
I probably would have had more to say because I would have had more interactions with people other than my age group. And that. So.
Yeah, would have been a college kid. You might have been at Kent State then.
If I can make a plug, Seton Hall University.
Yeah.
And Buffalo Bills. If I can.
Yeah.
Go Bills.
Go Bills, yeah.
Because if the Vietnam War doesn't happen, you wouldn't have had Kent State.
Right.
Think about that.
Well, you wouldn't have had a lot of things. I don't know if we've mentioned it during the podcast or off podcast about if we didn't have the Vietnam War, you wouldn't have had Nixon.
Yeah, you probably wouldn't have had Nixon.
You wouldn't have had. You might not have had Nixon. Because Johnson might have stayed president, and if you didn't have Nixon, all the things associated with him would have been different, changed, or wouldn't have occurred.
Well, I think his career politically would have just been dead in the water. He had run for governor of California in '64, and he had failed. He had lost.
Well, if he had lost to Johnson in '68, he would have been a two-time loser because he lost to Kennedy in '60.
A three-time loser.
Yeah. So, I don't see him. But again, that's presupposing he would have lost. He would have lost to Johnson, and that Johnson would have stayed in.
I think he would have lost had the Vietnam War not happened because he ran on a peace platform.
Yeah. But the only thing against Johnson would have been
civil rights.
Right. Exactly. Is the Civil Rights Act, which some people opposed. So it would have been some states he would have lost because of it. But I think you're right. I think even with that, I think he would have defeated Nixon because I don't think Nixon had much of a message other than, like you said,
which many folks don't actually know this. How long can someone be president of the United States? Do you guys know this?
2 terms.
No. How long can they be president of the United States?
8 years.
No.
It's technically 10, right?
It's 10 years. You can be president of the United States for 10 years because if you're the vice president and someone gets assassinated and you take over after 2 years of that first term, you can run for re-election twice.
You are correct.
So 10 years, technically.
You are correct.
He could have been a 10-year president.
You are correct. You know how I know you're correct
now?
Yeah. Because you're right. Kennedy was assassinated in, 62?
Yes.
Finished at his term. Won in 64.
63. He was assassinated.
Won in 64 and was running in 68. I hadn't thought about that. You're right.
Could have been a 10-year president.
You're right.
You know? But in that same way, I think our democracy has never fully recovered from Vietnam.
No, it hasn't.
You know,
our society, our society hasn't. Forget about government. I still think it's especially in the baby boomers like myself and that. It's still it's still something you remember, and especially the soldiers who were there, who went through the experience of fighting in Vietnam. That experience. I know anybody who's ever fought in combat says you never forget it.
Yeah,
you never forget it.
You never do.
You never do.
Now, the Paris Peace Accords were 1973 that ended the Vietnam War, technically, even though it has ended U.S. involvement.
Right.
The South Vietnamese never actually signed that peace treaty. They never actually ratified it, which most people leave out conveniently when they talk about the Vietnam War ending.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
Because it was a horrible peace treaty, because in the Paris Peace Accords, it allowed for Viet Cong and for North Vietnamese forces to stay in South Vietnam. Hence why the South Vietnamese didn't want to sign it. Could you imagine that?
Yeah, I don't blame them. But the fact is, even if it had been put in there, would it have mattered?
They probably wouldn't have followed it. Yeah.
No, it wouldn't have made. Basically, whether it was in there or not, they were going to unite South Vietnam with North Vietnam, and hell be damned if it was a peace treaty or whatever.
Now, 73, you were like a little bit older by then. Now, do you recall like U.S. veterans from the Vietnam War coming home and being treated a certain way? Like, do you ever recall hearing about it or seeing it?
No firsthand accounts, but just from what I've seen through how movies portray it, how news of veterans and stuff like that. Because it became an unpopular war. Anybody who returned from it, you weren't treated as heroes.
So I've heard stories of U.S. military personnel coming home from the Vietnam War, in uniform and being spit on by people.
Yeah.
Having
Being called
rocks
baby
thrown at them,
killers.
Oh, yeah.
being called, he said,
Yeah.
being called baby killers, when really the people you should be calling baby killers and spitting on were the politicians that sent them there. They're the ones you should be spitting on,
Absolutely.
Right.
not the average fighting man. The average fighting man, to me, is simply a victim of that system.
But the fact is, our military was put into a difficult, if not impossible, situation.
An unwinnable war.
Yeah, in other words, and I mean, a lot of our soldiers gave it them all. I know, reading about certain battles, about units getting surrounded and their buddies fighting through to rescue them and
Yeah.
stuff like that. There was a lot of heroism, a lot of camaraderie and courage
Yes.
displayed. But I think, like you said, the government really let them down.
In the end, their allies in South Vietnam were very unmotivated and unreliable.
Exactly.
That, if you were fighting with the South Vietnamese on your side, you had to worry about South Vietnamese soldiers sometimes turning on you and shooting you.
Well, that's what happened in Afghanistan.
Exactly, yeah.
Afghanistan, if you want to go to a modern and stuff like that. But it's the problem that you have when you're fighting in a situation where both sides are the same nationality.
Yes.
Because then who's your friend, who's your enemy? And, I know that had to be hell on earth for these soldiers to engage the public in Vietnam. Even little kids were used sometimes to kill soldiers. And
Make booby traps.
Right, and sometimes these soldiers had to kill children, and how that weighed on them.
It's the same principle.
And stuff like that, or women, or whatever. It's when you're in a situation where you don't know who your enemy is. That is a very unsettling situation.
Which then ties into the My Lai massacre,
right?
Which of course you know about.
It's basically, I think these guys just cracked.
Yeah,
they just cracked and just went after.
They went insane.
They were tired of not knowing who their enemy was, and just like in Afghanistan, you could have somebody with sympathies for the North. Being a Vietnamese soldier or being a civilian in South Vietnam, and you'd never know it. You turn your back and you're dead.
Because, most average peasants in the countryside of South Vietnam didn't give a fuck what government ruled them.
No.
As long as it was an independent Vietnamese government, they didn't care if it was communist, capitalist, or even a monarchy. They really didn't care.
No, the only ones I think were those who lived in the city.
And Saigon definitely cared.
Yeah, Saigon. What was it? The big Air Force base, Da Nang.
Yeah,
Da Nang and stuff like that. Yeah, some of the bigger cities who were, a little bit more involved, and stuff like that. But you're exactly right. The average public just wanted to live. They just wanted to make a living.
Like one of the actual myths I think surrounding the Vietnam War was that if we had used better strategy, that we could have won. I personally reject that theory. I went back and I watched a lecture by the writer Thomas E. Ricks, and it was about why were generals in World War II better and more efficient than generals in Korea and Vietnam. And he postulates that it was because of relief. That in World War II, if a general had showed poor combat effectiveness, you could be relieved of command. After World War II in Korea, there was no more relief or being fired for lack of combat effectiveness. Isn't that crazy to think about?
It is.
That there was no general or officers really fired in Vietnam. In fact, there was one, but it was not the guy who did My Lai. Isn't that crazy to think about?
Well, I think that gets into the situation with the military. Is that rather than firing, you give a medal.
See.
I can think. I don't want to get into it, but I can think of several examples where the people didn't follow orders, and things didn't happen well, and to cover it up, you give them a medal.
Yeah, they tried to cover up the My Lai massacre.
Yeah, and stuff like that. So that I think to your point, and maybe this summarizes it, is that there's less accountability.
Which makes you wonder, if they try to cover up the My Lai massacre and failed, how many massacres happened similar to My Lai that were covered up? Maybe there was 4 or 5 My Lais that happened that we didn't even know about.
It's possible, but I tend to think if it happened on the scale of My Lai, we probably would have heard about it.
You'd hope so.
Somehow, I think it would have come out, because if we couldn't hide Something smaller incidents, maybe something on the scale of My Lai. What was it? 200 people killed?
500.
Or was it 500? Okay, I got the number wrong. With 500 people killed, it's hard to hide that.
Not just killed, but also raped. They did try to hide it.
Yeah. But I think anything on the scale of My Lai would have been difficult to hide.
Now, a similar problem I think that we had with Afghanistan, as in Vietnam, was that everyone, essentially, the officers too, had about a year term of duty. In terms of like their service, you do a year, then be sent back home. In World War II, the way you got sent back home was to win the fucking war. Like the old saying was, the road home lies through Berlin, Tokyo, and Rome. That's how you get home. You had soldiers that fought for 4 or 5, years in that war straight. They just fought the entire way through. As opposed to, we have like officers and generals in Afghanistan or in Vietnam where the whole mindset was, okay, just go there, do your year, don't fuck up, don't make any mistakes, and then hand the problem off to the next guy in 1 year.
But the thing of it is, did we fight to win?
I think we did fight to win, but we did use terrible strategy.
Yeah. So in other words, I think it comes down to, it's like, I don't know if we knew what victory was. I'm thinking back to Malaysia. This might have been the strategy that they would clear out a section, and then secure it, go to another. I think rather than in general trying to do attrition, I think they really tried to secure area after area after area, and not allow them back in. And I think that's maybe what the British did. I don't think we did that.
Not as effectively.
No.
Like the real quagmire in Vietnam comes down to bad strategy, but I think that the only real way you could win Vietnam would be to risk World War III. Where I think, how could you really win Vietnam without doing at least a limited invasion of the North? Which then, if you invade North Vietnam, you risk direct Chinese involvement.
Exactly, yeah.
Just like in Korea.
Right, exactly. That would have, because then you're coming up to China's border, and the only way out of it was to unify Vietnam.
Yeah,
you had to find a way to unify Vietnam without going to war. And I think I don't know if we got into it on the podcast, but after World War II, Ho Chi Minh went to the French, went to the Americans to negotiate the independence of Vietnam.
Yes.
And we rejected them. France went back in as a colonial power. The United States backed them. Ho Chi Minh then was forced to fight and forced to seek support from Russia and China. Had we handled that differently, had we said yes, the biggest mistake probably was to divide Vietnam.
Alternate history
is to get because it was untenable.
Think, like, how would someone like FDR have handled that?
It was untenable. The Vietnamese weren't going to accept it, and stuff like that. And so, had we right from the start said we're not going to, in France it said, we're not going to be a colonial power.
Yeah.
Let's give you your independence. Let's maintain a good relationship, and Vietnam doesn't occur.
Because FDR did not want to have the European powers maintain their colonies in Southeast Asia or around the world. His deal with the British was, we'll help you win World War II, but afterwards you have to give up your colonies. And Churchill said, okay, we'll agree to that, because if we don't do this, Britain won't exist anyway.
Yeah. But and then the British with India, and stuff like that. Eventually, it happened because eventually having colonies became untenable. The people did not want you ruling them. The Vietnamese did not want the French ruling them. The Vietnamese really did not want the Americans, there for the most part. And I don't know if countries have learned that lesson yet. Look at the Russians in Ukraine. The Ukrainians don't want them. Russians think, oh yeah, let's Ukraine, let's take it. They don't want you.
Yeah,
they don't want you, and stuff like that. if they want you, they'll let you know, and then you can establish that kind of a relationship. But I think that's the biggest mistake. I don't think countries have learned it to this day, that you're not wanted in certain places. They don't want you ruling them or
to export democracy.
Yeah, well, even not to export democracy, but just to. They don't want somebody from the outside telling them what to do. Anybody, it's like if I were to tell you, Steve, I'm going to from now on, I'm going to rule you. I'm going to tell you what you can do. Blah blah blah.
Go away, Dad.
Would you accept that?
Fuck no.
Hell no, you wouldn't. No, of course you wouldn't. And it's the same thing with countries. If there is going to be a relationship between countries that's very close, it is by their decision and not enforced on them.
Now, did the military in Vietnam have poor leadership? Were their hands tied? In some aspects, I would say so. Like, generals complained that we couldn't actually mine, like, Haiphong Harbor in North Vietnam, because then we would risk actually destroying Russian boats going there.
Cargo ships, yeah.
And one thing was that I think a lot of pilots complained is that we actually couldn't attack Vietnamese SAM missile sites until they were set up, because the people setting them up were Soviet advisors. So it's like, yes, were their hands tied a little bit? I'd be remiss if I didn't say yes. But at the same time, if you start killing Soviet advisors and start taking out Soviet ships, you do risk escalation to World War III.
Yeah. But so they couldn't fight Vietnam as they did World War II.
They couldn't fight a total war.
Right. They couldn't fight a total war. And I think to that extent, they were hamstrung. Even then, would they have been successful? I doubt it.
But the question is, what is total war in the nuclear age?
Death.
There probably is no total war, at least not between nuclear powers or countries who have relationships with nuclear powers that would protect them. Because if you go to total war, then there is always that nuclear weapon thing. And in fact, that's nowadays that's what Russia's been threatening every chance they get. If you do this for Ukraine, if you do this for Ukraine, which so far has been bluff, and I think it is bluff. But I mean, that's my opinion.
It's MAD. It's mutually assured destruction.
Yeah, and stuff like that. I mean, they know if they attack us, we can blow them up, and who wins? Nobody wins. Nobody wins a nuclear war.
The key question is, if Putin wanted to launch nukes, would he even be able to? Because I know they actually have more checks and balances to launch nuclear weapons, and they actually have here. Here, if the president says to launch nuclear weapons, they have to be launched. There, they actually have a system of checks and balances where I think at least 5 other people have to agree.
Yeah, but I think that's assuming it hasn't changed.
Yeah,
because you got to remember, if Putin has now become really the absolute ruler of Russia, and I don't see, if he wants to launch nukes, that anybody's going to countermand him, or if
he could be cool if he tried to do it.
Well, that would be the only. It depends. It depends on, as long as he has the support of the security apparatus and the army, nobody would. It would take somebody to say no. But in terms of somebody simply saying no and not having it happen, I don't think that's the case. If Putin says it, that's the order, no matter what anybody else thinks. Now, if you follow it, it's another story. But I think Putin. I think any in between people are simply yes men. They're not really.
Because the last time we came closest to really using nuclear weapons was probably the Vietnam War. Because Westmoreland, during the Battle of Khe Sanh, did consider using a tactical nuclear weapon to take out certain roads and bridges. And even Nixon, if you actually go back and listen to the Nixon tape.
I still think we ought to take the ice off now. I think we let drown people get drowned about 200 people. Well, no, I'd rather use a nuclear bomb if that's that great. And that, I think, would just be too much. The nuclear bomb, is that probably? I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sake.
He actually considers using nuclear weapons. He actually tells Kissinger that he actually wants to use a tactical nuclear weapon.
I think
Kissinger told him, no, please don't do that.
Yeah, I think previous to that, things were pretty tight around the Cuban Missile Crisis, too.
Yes.
That was the only other time I think we would have came anywhere close to it.
MacArthur wanted to use tactical nuclear weapons
Is it Korea?
against Korea. Yeah, his plan was to irradiate the Korean border between Manchuria and Korea with uranium cobalt and tactical nuclear weapons to make it an impassable border for 50 years.
If you were going to win a nuclear war, the time to do it was then.
The time to do it was 45,
Exactly.
with the monopoly on the bomb.
Right, exactly. Because then nobody else could really retaliate against you. So if they were going to do it, that was the time. Now, I'm not saying you should, or I'm just saying you could do it and get away with it if you were.
Do you think Operation Unthinkable was a winnable war?
I'm sorry, Operation Unthinkable?
It was the code name for the operation of having the British and the Americans go to war with the Soviet Union directly following World War II.
Oh, okay, I don't recall that name for it. I know Patton wanted to do it.
Patton definitely wanted. Churchill wanted to do it too.
Patton wanted to deal with because Patton saw the Soviet Union for what it was. So did Churchill. But if the movie is accurate, the movie Patton,
it's a great movie.
Yeah, it is a great movie. He told one of his superiors that, hey, I can even make it look like it's their fault.
Yeah,
stuff like that. And I've seen scenarios that have been developed of how that would have played out.
War games, yeah.
War games if we had have attacked,
So I do ponder that. Would it have been morally right to do it, knowing what happened in Eastern Europe, following the coming down of the Iron Curtain, to actually go to war, to actually push them out? In some ways, part of me says yes, then part of me says no. I think with the information that we had at that time, they did make the right choice. But with the new information that has come out, the Russian army was exhausted after fighting World War II. That had we fought them right after World War II, they probably would have fallen apart. We kind of got scared of paper tigers.
Yeah, well, there's a difference between what morally we should have done and what history maybe says we should have done.
Yeah.
Morally, it wouldn't have been right.
You are right, yeah.
They were our allies. They helped us defeat Nazi Germany and Japan. And then to turn on them, it's not moral. But if you look at it in terms of how history played out.
That's what I'm saying. But,
but
on one hand, we didn't want to abandon the Poles. FDR did advocate for the Poles. He did make Stalin promise free and fair elections in Poland. But ultimately, we did abandon the Poles.
Well,
and the Czechs.
Oh yeah, but the other thing was, what the Soviets did to the Poles during World War II.
Yeah,
they were at the gates of Warsaw
and chose to have the Warsaw Uprising be destroyed.
Right, and you know why they didn't interfere with the Germans in the uprising? Because they wanted the Polish resistance crushed.
Yes,
before they took over. That is why they didn't get involved. They didn't want to stop. They didn't want to have to deal with any armed resistance from the Poles when they finally took over Poland, and so they just let the Warsaw Massacre occur, and then once it was all over, okay, then we'll go in.
It's a brutal way to do it.
Oh yeah, but that was the Soviet Union.
That was the Soviet model.
Yeah, and it's still followed today in Ukraine.
Yeah.
If you look at how they're fighting Ukraine, it's the same exact philosophy.
Well, Putin said it, he actually wants to reestablish the Russian Empire. And he's been on record for saying that the biggest disaster of the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991.
Exactly, Steve. You got that right.
Yes. Former KGB operative.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, but that's always been his biggest regret. So, I think anybody, just to make a little point, anybody who thinks we shouldn't support Ukraine is wrong, because they are fighting an entity which wants to reestablish the Russian Empire. And, if Putin has his say, he won't stop till that happens.
Well, just like in Vietnam, the question is, where do you draw that line? Is sending weapons, aids, and economic aid, is that the line, or is the line actually sending in U.S. combat troops? Where is the line, just like in Vietnam? Because I think with South Vietnam, I have no problem with us sending advisors, maybe economic aid, weapons, but combat troops, I have to draw the line there.
Yeah, it's not necessary in Ukraine. The problem with Ukraine was that fearful of of what Russia would do, off the get-go, we didn't send them the weapon systems they needed. We were always slow. They're always getting the weapon systems after, the need, things arose. Had we armed them to the teeth off to the start, there was a window last year where if they had, planes, necessary artillery, and everything else, they took over. They reclaimed part of their thing. The Russians were reeling, and because we really didn't send them what they needed, the Russians have been able to regroup and are now back on the offensive. Yeah. But there may be another opportunity down the road, but we missed it in 2020. We missed it in 2023 because I think then the Ukrainians could have really made some hay.
Because there were folks at the Pentagon calling for a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which would have meant World War III.
Yeah, it's what we would have done in most situations. The question is, would Russia have called our bluff?
They might have had to.
See, I think Russia. The reason Russia is sticking this thing out is they question the resolve of the United States
and of Ukraine.
No, not of Ukraine. Ukraine you don't question. No, it's not Ukraine's resolve they question. It's the support for Ukraine from the U.S., European countries, and other countries around the world that they will tire of this war. We will stop supporting Ukraine, and then they'll have free hand. The Ukrainians will never, ever give in to the Soviet Union, give in to Russia.
Would you support a peace under status quo antebellum?
No.
Which is a restoring of the pre-war borders?
No.
No?
No. Because Russia then would profit from illegal actions. And that would be like, what was it with Chamberlain?
Munich Agreement.
Yeah, the Munich Agreement, where you pacified Hitler by giving him territory.
Yeah.
Trust me, we could do that, and then Russia would find another excuse to try to get more territory. They will not stop.
I remember one time I was trying to explain that to a friend that had we not checked Hitler in Europe, his expansion would have not stopped in Europe. He would have went for world domination. You believe that, don't you?
Yeah. I think that would have been his psyche.
In his second book that went unpublished, he actually outlines that the one way in his mind to get global peace would be to have a one world government. That's what he outlines.
Well, see, I'm a Star Trek fan, and I kind of believe in the Federation and everything else. I think that's the Earth's best hope. Eventually, is for us to put aside our, regional and
racial disputes.
Well, not racial disputes, but the fact is, our country or being countries or whatever, and think of us not as a country or a race or whatever, but being as people of Earth. And that if you had a central government, you could more easily address the problems of the Earth. And not, because democracies, as much as we like them, are messy. And what we have in the world right now is a democracy where every nation has its own opinion, and it's hard sometimes to get things done.
We will aid Cambodia. Cambodia is the Nixon doctrine in its purest form. In Cambodia, what we are doing is helping the Cambodians to help themselves.